Welcome to the show. This is the Magician and the Fool podcast, episode number 72. My name is Dominic. I'm one of the co-hosts of the show. The other co-host is named Janus, and he will pop in once we get started. Today we have quite an epic episode for everyone. We have not one, not two, not three, but 4 guests, which logistically was a little bit of a challenge to get scheduled, but we made it work. And it's going to be a good one. So who are these guests that we have on today? Well, we have returning guest P.D. Newman, who we spoke to back in episode number 67, and he talked about his book on Theurgy when we had him on, which was fantastic. Also in this episode, Mr. Greg Shaw, which we've had on quite a few times, way back in episode number 8, then in episode number 37 alongside Edward Butler to discuss the Parmenides, and then again in episode number 69 to discuss his new book on Platonic Tantra. Greg, of course, is one of the leading voices regarding the subject of Theurgy. We were so happy to have him back on. He's always so generous with his time and his knowledge. We definitely feel very privileged to be able to talk with him so often. Not only is he a highly respected scholar, but he is just a genuinely cool guy. In this episode, we have a new guest that we haven't spoke to before. Her name is Diane Zingale. She has experience in witchcraft, with ceremonial magic, with the martial arts, and with esoteric Buddhism. So she was a great addition to this conversation. Last but not least, Mr. Ronnie Pontiac, who we spoke to back in episode number 68 regarding his book on the Orphic hymns, which again, fantastic, highly recommended. And I want to give a special thanks to Ronnie for really spearheading this conversation and getting it organized and scheduled. Not sure if we could have done it without his persistence. And since I'm talking about Ronnie, I want to just emphasize what a cool guy he is and how much I enjoy talking with him, and that I highly recommend going and checking out not only his published work, but his YouTube interviews. I would definitely highlight his interviews with Jeffrey Mishlove on the New Thinking Aloud channel. Absolutely wonderful interviews. You definitely will not regret spending the time to watch and listen to them. Ronnie is just super articulate, very likable, charismatic, and super knowledgeable. So please do yourself a favor and check those out. So the topic of this roundtable discussion is Theurgy, essentially. More specifically, the practical practice of Theurgy and how that could look in a modern context to a modern person. It's a big topic, it's a difficult topic, but I think there are an adequate number of breadcrumbs left behind by the ancient philosophers and practitioners that we can piece something fairly coherent together. Before we start, as always, I want to say thank you to our Patreon supporters. We sincerely appreciate your support. If anyone out there would like to also lend a hand and help keep the show running and the lights on here, feel free to partner with us. Go to our Patreon page and do what feels right for you. We dedicate this to Hermes and Asclepius, and may any merits that we accumulate doing this work be distributed to all sentient beings so that they, together with us, may equally realize awakening. Welcome to the show. This is going to be quite an episode. We have essentially assembled the Avengers here today in this podcast. We've got some old faces as well as some new faces, and we are going to do things a little bit differently today. It's more like a roundtable discussion. And to start it off, we're just going to go around the roundtable and have everyone introduce themselves, and then we will jump into conversation from there. So maybe let's start with our newest member, Diane.
Hello, everyone. There's various things that I've been involved with. I've been on a magical path since I was 19. I'm 69 now. I'll just throw out a few of the things I'm into. I'm Grand Cancellaria, Fraternity of Hidden Light. I'm a trained priest for Mikyo Shingon, esoteric type of Buddhism. I'm a martial artist. And I think it's one universe, and these are all paths pointing at the same thing. So.
Awesome. Who's next? Greg, how about you?
Sure. I'm Greg Shaw, and I've done a lot of work on Neoplatonism, and specifically on Iamblichus and Theurgy, and I just published a book entitled Hellenic Tantra, which is my effort to open us up to understanding Theurgy in a more realistic way by comparing it to South Asian Tantra. And I was hoping that doing that would allow people to get a more realistic understanding of what Theurgists were up to and not see them as some sort of failed Plotinian Platonists or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
P.D.
My name's P.D. Newman. I've kind of started my research in the domains of things like Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism and Martinism, but I've slowly kind of moved more into the field of Neoplatonism and still got one foot in the magical grimoire kind of side of things, but my main focus currently is on models of ascent, whether it be Theurgy or Native American afterlife journeys, which is what my next book is going to be on. But yeah, ascent models are really what I'm looking at these days.
Awesome. And last but not least, Ronnie.
I am thrilled to be here with all of you. I was Manly Palmer Hall's assistant for research and also his screener for about 7 years when I was a kid. And I have since been the author of a book called American Metaphysical Religion, which is a look at the extremely ever-present and influential esoteric presence in American history that has been ignored pretty much until recently. We've had a great revolution in academia where we now can be looking at these matters and looking into archives that we've never seen before. And what was revealed to me was a great alternative history of America filled with wonderful characters and with great ideas and hybrids and just a teeming spiritual hotbed. I've also co-authored a book called The Magic of the Orphic Hymns. And that to me relates to Theurgy because I see the Orphic hymns as on one hand being an echo of the great litany of Sekhmet, Diane, and the praising and the places and the correspondences. And then on the other side, this leads directly to Theurgy because I believe that the hymns, when they're presented together, are a kind of transformative, meditative, sacred music that brings us closer to an awareness of divine wisdom and of the grace that is sown throughout this world. And so my interest is also in models of ascent, as PD said, but I'm also very interested in countercultures and in the way throughout history, whether it be Orphic or it be Rosicrucian, There are these repeating themes, often hermetic and often Platonic, and the same heroes keep showing up as the inspiration in these countercultures. So that's who I am.
Excellent. And of course, everyone that listens to our podcast is familiar with Janus. Janus, do you want to say hello?
Hey everyone, my name is Janus, and I am one of the hosts of the Magician and the Fool podcast. And I'm very excited to be a part of this intriguing, engrossing discussion.
Cool. And with that, we're going to hand the talking stick over to Ronnie to kind of kick things off, if you don't mind.
Not at all. So this was inspired by my appreciation for Greg's most recent book about Hellenic Tantra and using the Eastern approach of the Southeastern form of Tantra, which Greg can address, to help us to understand what's going on in Theurgy. And having run into these similarities in other places, similar ideas and practices. So, for example, within the hymns of Orpheus, or even in channeled materials such as the unobstructed universe teachings, which reflect the secret of the golden flower and the Platonic teachings so exactly that we would wonder about plagiarism if we weren't certain that there was no contact. And so I hope that everyone we've gathered here, all of you are multidimensional, and that we can enjoy picking each other's brains and hearts about what the path is and how this ascent happens. And after all, it's our heritage, it's our destiny to be liberated, to regain, as the Orphics would say, remembering of our immortal selves. And so I hope that we can find some wonderful stories to share that will inspire people.
Awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So go Greg.
Yeah,
sorry.
go ahead.
No, I didn't really have anything. I was just going to fumble and try to get things rolling. But if you have something, definitely.
I'm all for your way of fumbling, Dominic. It's always worked for me.
Okay, well, let me begin the fumbling. So as far as theurgy goes, I think we're all familiar with the general definition. And so we're speaking of more modern or lived traditions as well, as Ronnie and Greg have pointed out, and Diane and also PD. The East Asian traditions are alive and well, and they've been continuously, being practiced for centuries. And there are a lot of obvious similarities between what goes on in a lot of the tantric traditions and what presumably went on with classical theurgy. I was wondering if we can maybe just start off with similarities that we each are able to identify.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
It may not be an exact response to that question, but
Sure.
I think one of the issues that I think that I noticed both in my own trajectory, because I've been around doing this sort of thing as long as you, Diane, pursuing spirituality. I ended up going into an academic context to do it, but I was kind of undercover as an academic. Never really quite felt like a professor because I was more interested in the spiritual realities of things than I was in getting the right footnotes and who explained what and who drew from what source, that sort of game that most academics play. One of the things I noticed with regard to theurgy is that there's a habit, I think, even among people who are interested in spirituality, to think that getting to what's essential in us means that we have to get away from our embodied life, that we have to get into some sort of spiritual place that has no faults, no dirt, no mess. And I just sensed that in a lot of people who practice spiritual things, that there was an attempt to sort of fit into some sort of kind of predefined idea of what perfection is. And among scholars, there was a sense of, when they were writing about the Platonists and about the Theurgists and about Plotinus, they all assumed that it was all about getting away from this messy and dirty place that we're living in and getting into this purely refined and glorious and light-filled realm that's far away from my ordinary life. And somehow, in reading Eunapius's lives of the philosophers and theurgists, and reading Iamblichus, I felt like that this approach is missing something essential to what was present among theurgists, and that is they were embodied, they lived together, they drank wine together, they were, and some of the theurgists themselves were people who were perceived to be empowered or had superhuman kinds of energies and capacities. And you don't see anybody writing about that in the academic study of the Platonists. They avoid it because it can't make sense, because I think today most everyone is a materialist. It doesn't fit into the materialist point of view. So in order to try to open people up to what was really going on in our Western culture among the later Platonists, I found that you do see this kind of phenomena among Eastern traditions, among the tantrics, among yogis, who are empowered individuals who have supernormal capacities. And that's considered to be normal within that tradition. And I thought we can learn from them. If we can imagine what was going on in the Iamblichian circles and in the theurgical circles with the eyes of what's going on even today in tantric circles, I think we can understand better what's part of our own history in the West. And part of that history, I think, Ronnie, you referred to as a kind of a counterculture, that this other history has percolated underneath the surface, but you can see it in magical traditions and in other circles. And usually it includes some sort of empowered human beings. And sometimes that gets perverted in either in stories or maybe even the people themselves. And it's not always clear how to handle energy when it comes down to us. But I think there's something that we've been missing in our Western tradition. And that's what I was trying to bring out by using the tantric angle to look at what Iamblichus was doing. Yeah, Diane.
I just had some comments on what you said.
Yeah.
To me, the magical path is making that inner connection, that inner intuition that then guides you. And without that, following a tradition, it's just a fossil. And so it really, when I think about what happened in the past, they must have had and valued that living connection with the gods. And then the energy comes and you follow that intuition, because each one's different. There's no one size fits all. And I noticed that also in the Shingon training. There's the different grandmasters I'd encountered and trained with. They're very much on their own path within a framework.
To relate to what you're saying, that's why it's sort of false to say, well, what was the Neoplatonic explanation for, or what did the Neoplatonists say that you should do in this situation? And it's different for every person. And every teacher is going to engage situations unique to that particular teacher or philosopher or theurgist. And that's harder to create a conceptual map for, because it's alive.
The intuitions and things that come from the mysteries can't be spoken, so that you can't explain it to someone else. It's an experience.
Yeah.
If I could, I'd like to jump in just for a moment to illustrate something that each of you said, to illustrate the history in America of this particular, let's call it amnesia, that Western esotericism has suffered. And in the 1880s, around 1888, actually, there was a newspaper published out of St. Louis, Missouri, called The Platonist. And it contained translations of Iamblichus and Proclus and Porphyry and actually also of Eliphas Levi and of Sufi writers. And And the person behind this, Thomas Johnson, was a dedicated practitioner who was personally translating these materials. He was very known to Emerson and Thoreau and the other New England transcendentalists who turned to him as the expert on these matters. And he was hoping that with Plato so popular at that time in America, being written about in the great newspapers, there were all kinds of parties celebrated for Plato's birthday, even out in the prairie. And he thought this was the beginning of a revolution. But actually, right around the corner was Professor Shorey and his very different view of Platonism. And he actually kind of pointed out Thomas Johnson as, now that's that mystical Neoplatonic garbage that doesn't have anything to do with it. But we had this living tradition here with Thomas Johnson, who was also the president of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor in the West. And they were using hashish pills and special meditations and doing all kinds of kind of proto-theurgic operations in order to achieve this higher state of being, the divine vision, and also to attract higher grade souls to incarnate through their children and such. It's very different. And Shorey and Johnson battled briefly. Of course, Johnson had no platform. And then that point of view was eradicated for most of what remained of the 20th century. And so we do have, though, this history of people practicing their kind of theurgic approaches to spirituality in America going way back.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. And it's remarkable to me because you intuited literally what I was about to refer to was the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor or of Light. And concurrently, Paschal Beverly Randolph, who was really at the root of it, along with Max Theon and other just intriguing figures. But what I wanted, you brought that up, and I think that's perfect because one of the things that I think we need to do is understand that when we're talking about Neoplatonism or when we're talking about Tantra, getting a little bit away from being pigeonholed by the terms. Oh, okay, so Tantra is just this thing that happens over there in the East, and Neoplatonism is this thing that only happened in Greece at this, during this time, or, in the late antique world. And when we understand what those terms are referring to, the experience, the method, the orientation towards reality, then we can sort of transcend the limitations of these descriptions. What the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor were doing is very close to what you find in Shaktism, in Shaktism in India, for instance, or for that matter, in certain branches of Sufism. So what we're seeing here is a method of interacting with the transcendental and with the interior and with the spiritual world, which interpenetrates with this world. And there's a sort of radical immanentism, I think, in the tantric perspective, which refuses to impute a inaccessible distance to the spiritual and instead insists on the immediacy and the availability of that experience to human beings.
These are living traditions. Yeah.
Yeah, that's something that dovetails with what I was going to say about something Diane said, which is that this conundrum at the center of all of these activities, which is that there is this tradition that we want to follow, and it's strictly kept. But then on the other hand, we have, for example, from the founder of Shingon Buddhism, this wonderful remark where he said, "Do not seek to follow in the footsteps of the men of old, seek what they sought." And so he's telling us there, we're showing you that it can be done, but don't do it the way we did it because it won't work that way for you. And I think that this is something that relates to what Janus was just saying about how here we are with all of these traditions, all of these models of ascent, all of these ladders. I mean, unlike any other time in history, I mean, maybe the closest thing was Alexandria or some similar city in the East. We now have access to so many traditions from throughout history, from everywhere in the world. And so many of us become collectors of ladders. And many people never climb the ladders. They just collect a bunch of them and argue about the ladders. And I think everyone here is a ladder climber as well as collector, which makes it exciting. But the fact that we can achieve this ourselves, as you mentioned, and that we can have this, as Emerson was calling for, an immediate relationship with revelation, as opposed to this kind of curated experience of it, is at the heart of sharing all these traditions and comparing, because I couldn't agree more. I think that this is the human experience. And so, of course, it reflects in all the great traditions. And when I was a student of Manly Hall's, he always talked about there's a truth at the core of all religions. And a lot of people take offense at that because you can choose examples that look very different. But over many years of study, now it's one of the joys of study is finding in all sorts of weird places these same truths.
It's one universe that has energies, and people put different symbols on them and different faces and different cultures, but those energies are what they are. Yeah.
I think the resistance, and then I want to hear PD to speak too, because you got a lot on your mind, PD, but I just wanted to say one thing in response to that. So-called the critique of perennialism, that there's one truth, there's one reality, and different traditions are getting at it in different ways. What I understand about the critique of that is that there's a tendency among us ladder gatherers to conceptualize the ultimate ladder situation. And then we create this one ladder, which is made of all these ladders. And then we kind of create an idol or a false notion of the reality and say it's all one, and this is how the all one works. And I understand the resistance to that, because that takes away from what Diane was talking about, that it's lived and it has to be unique and it has to be spontaneous. But it's very difficult to create a framework for a spontaneous way of accessing our depth, because it can't be, nailed down like that. And that's just my reflection on that perennialist critique. But I'm eager to hear what PD has to say about any of this, because you're so immersed in this stuff, and your background is very interesting. How you moved from being a Mason to Neoplatonism. And
well, I think what you said is a great point about the perennial tendency. Even though it, by the time we get to Mirandola and Reuchlin, and they really focus on that idea of perennialism. But I think at the same time, it's also important to draw lines where they need to be drawn in order to allow a tradition its own uniqueness. And I think some of that can be lost in translation. But in regard to what Janice brought up earlier, and Ronnie, you also, the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, Janice said something in regard to not getting pigeonholed by these traditions. And I think that's true even within the claims of the individual traditions themselves. It's also important to be objective, because when you look at the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, especially by the time Blavatsky has published The Secret Doctrine, there's this staunch rejection of anything Eastern and a real strong attempt to limit that HBL label to Western modalities. But it's only in name at that point, because when you look at the modalities themselves, the hashish consumption, the focus on sexual intercourse, and even the magic mirror gazing, those have long histories in the East that are clearly evident in the practices. But if we were to listen to what people like Peter Davidson are what they're saying in these writings, that they're rejecting this Eastern approach, I think what I'm getting at is there are dangers involved in both approaches for a person trying to seriously work with this stuff.
when I first became interested in these topics or in this current of experience, I didn't know where to turn. I just picked up books that appealed to me, and I began to read them, and one thing led to another. And when Ronnie says that he worked with Manly Palmer Hall, I there's a part of me that feels like, oh my God, he was in the high temple of the esoteric kingdom, and he was like a crown prince to the great King Manly Hall. I mean, in my mind, that's what Manly Palmer Hall was. It was just this amazing guy, and the Secret Teachings of All Ages was like the ultimate Bible book with all those great pictures and the print. And people like me needed stuff like that because it spoke to a hunger, I think. I think a lot of us come to this with a hunger for something deeper and something more real that our external culture, which is now increasingly materialist and so-called science-based, it doesn't give us that depth or meaning. And it's how to fulfill that depth, the hunger for depth and meaning without leading people down a very fucked up path of nuttiness. It's not always easy to do it because people do get kind of lost in some sort of imagery that it's mostly has to do with their own psychological needs rather than with some balance between what's in them and what they're encountering. And it's not, we don't have schools where you can go and somebody says, I'm hearing what you're saying, but you need to tune it up this way, or you need to tune it down that way. We're sort of individuals working at our best to do it. And the fact that we're sitting here talking to each other means that somehow we have maintained some kind of resonant expression of our engagement with this tradition or these traditions that has worked, at least for some people. And credit to us for doing that. But it's not that easy. I mean, there aren't communities that will tell you, well, you're a little bit off here, you're right on target there. And I don't know how it is for you guys, but it's kind of, maybe Diane, you have.
Yeah, I have a few comments. I'm getting excited. By the way, I'm a French Mason, master Mason in the French Rite in Half Moon Bay, respectable humanist lodge. And
awesome.
So a lodge is where your brothers and sisters can get you back on track when you're getting maybe inflated or whatever might happen. We used to call it high priestitis or high priestessitis. But I just wanted to just share how I got started. Yeah. I started with the Dion Fortune's fiction, the rituals in Dion Fortune's fiction. A group of us 20-somethings who, I was a freshman at MIT. I'm an MIT-trained electrical engineer. There were a bunch of us in the stacks at Boston University pulling together ritual. Well, first of all, we did Dion Fortune's ritual. We connected with Isis. And then this blast of stuff just manifested and ritual. So we were working Greek and Egyptian on the tree as a framework and pulling stuff from all over the place, that would relate to the different God forms. And the system manifested in 1973. And we're, so it comes out of nowhere. And then you see the connection, quantum physics connects into how this stuff works. It's all natural. It's, not supernatural. I don't know if I'm making sense, but
yeah, you're making a lot of sense. What was interesting is he said it came from nowhere.
It manifested it, and this was a group of. Well, actually, we were a Wiccan coven that went ceremonial after we connected with Isis because it was clear that Wiccan wasn't sufficient, though it's necessary. You need that green ray. You need that touch to have things balance.
May I ask, could you elaborate a little bit about what the response from Isis was in that ritual? Like what manifestations did you experience?
Oh, it was it was pretty incredible. We did the rituals in Sea Priestess and Moon Magic, where she invokes Isis, and you would have experiences, and this didn't involve any drugs at all, where you were in a different temple, you were in a different place, as she describes in the ritual, and things would happen. The synchronicities would start when you got out. We got to the point where we started working. We had a room set apart as a temple, always there, and we were working 2-3 times a week. And it was compelling, and it worked for us. Yeah.
You mentioned the high priestess itis and high priest itis. And
that's a Wiccan term for people.
I think it's an important
instead of serving them.
Well, I've thought that it's almost inevitable and unavoidable if you go down this path. Because it's just you're different from your run-of-the-mill person who isn't interested in exploring these kinds of issues, and you realize that you're different, and you struggle to explain to yourself how it is that you are different, and you don't want to think, well, I'm a freak, I'm worse than them, and so the alternative is to think, well, I'm better than them, because that feels a little bit better. But we get drawn into, I guess you call it inflation stories. I think it's inevitable, and I don't think we should feel bad about it either. And I'm sure that at this point you don't feel bad, huh?
And it's classic, and the only people who are when the pompous language starts, and it's so obvious when someone's in that place, and the only people who are going to maybe have a clue of drawing you out of it are your coven mates, your lodge mates, your people who you trust, who can say, hey, listen to yourself, and sometimes it just takes time. The universe will provide stringent experiences to get you out of there. Go ahead.
I want to jump in here and say that I actually had a conversation with Manly Hall once, where I asked him if he had it all to do again, what would he do differently? And if you're familiar with his history in the early days, he was quite a glamour puss, and he was selling a lot of high occult reverie, and he regretted it. He saw the harm that it actually wound up causing, and even continued to cause as people got inflated, maybe reacting to what may have been his inflation. When I knew him, he was a very down-to-earth, wholesome, just folks kind of a man. I mean, he was wonderful to be around. And he said that what he would do differently is that he would ask that people study some form of psychology or take some form of psychological course before they enter into heavy metaphysical studies and practices, whatever they may be. Because he felt that what happens is so many of us who are seeking because of trauma that we've received, we bring that damage and have it amplified. Blavatsky used to say that when you get on the path, the first thing that happens is all the worst qualities that you've had in your previous incarnations come zooming up, demanding attention. And I think that I saw that with him particularly because he was a kind of court of last resort for people coming from all kinds of different areas, ceremonial magic, spiritualism, I mean, almost anything, traditional religions. And they would go off into either incredibly inflated, arrogant, and deluded perceptions of who they were and their relationship to the world and their destinies, or they would become fearful. A ceremonial magician who realized, I didn't quite do that right when I closed the circle. Next thing they know, they feel that there's an entity attached or there's a demon tormenting them. And as his screener, he had me dealing with these people as part of my education. It was very sobering to see the desperation amongst people who were trying to have spiritual understanding, but who became derailed. And they would come to him as if he were a school or a high priest who could bring some sort of light into their darkness. And he did many times. He had all kinds of wonderful advice and tricks that he had learned over the years to help people to cope with situations like that. But I agree very much with Greg about how unfortunate it is that we don't have traditions that are available to anyone. We do have wonderful traditions, and I agree completely with Diane that in Masonry, in covens, even PRS itself at the time that I was there was that kind of place where it was run at that time by elder women for the most part. And if you got, I mean, they would bust your balls, they were really wonderful, funny, brilliant women. And while they were supporting you with gifts of inspiration and books and such, they were also making sure that you were carefully pruned and fertilized and all that. And those kind of communities are great. And some of that can happen online, but in my experience, it isn't quite the same. And I do hear a lot from young people who have listened to me talk or have read my wife Tamara's book about our time back then, and who will say, "Oh my God, I wish there was something like that now, where I could go to where there's a bunch of people and they were all doing the same kind of thing." And so hopefully there will be an answer to that someday.
I think Israel Regardie, Golden Dawn figure, I think he had the same requirement in regard to psychology before he would take you on as a student. I know the author who writes under the name Christopher S. Hyatt, he noted that Regardie made him not just study psychology, but enroll in college to study psychology and actually graduate before he would work with him. But in regard to the notion of inflation that Greg brought up, I do think it's inevitable, because with this notion of divinization that you see, and even in like Orthodox Christianity, they call it theosis, but they have this real idea that you become divinized. And I think the first step to anything resembling what they're describing is coming to terms with the notion that all of the gods can't fit in the ego. And Jung warned against that also with the instead of incorporating the ego into what he called the self, the danger is that you try to incorporate these archetypes into the ego. And divinization, I think, could sound a lot like that at first, that you embody this God. But I think that experience is, and the consequences of it are what really opens the door to the real practice, the real meat of it, which is getting out of your own way so that the gods can just be, instead of you trying to be the gods.
As a priest, one of the things in this alternative tradition that I practice within, which is a Gnostic tradition, is that the primacy is laid not on internalization of a Baroque theological position or the memorization of scriptural passages, but rather the number one, the having had some kind of direct experience with the sacred, with the numinous, and number two, rather than acting as an intermediary who stands between the aspirant and the numinous, acting as a facilitator and a guide and a helpmeet and a servant who tries to get them to that door. We can't give them that experience. You can't give another person this experience, but as someone who, are you experienced? As someone who's experienced, you can assist them in attaining that. And I also do believe, of course, that the sacraments are based in this septenary system of the ancient mystery religions, and function in a Neoplatonic way, in that they purify and then illuminate and then sanctify the soul so that it becomes more rarefied and subtilized and able to access the interiority that is the prerequisite for perceiving these things. Because, for instance, if you're in the temple and Isis is manifesting, but your consciousness is in a very tamasic state, you may not even be able to perceive what is right in front of you. So it's necessary that the consciousness be rarefied. But to rewind a little bit here, I guess my point is the other part of that is priesthood, exoteric or esoteric, is based in community. And community, it cannot be had through parasocial electronic relationships. The community must be had by going out there and hugging people and talking to people and having coffee with people and celebrating holidays and mysteries and sharing meals with people and reading books together and smelling flowers together and swimming together and sitting down and talking when somebody's having a hard time with something and being a listener to them. You know, the community of meat space, so to speak, I think that's what the kids say these days, is important. It's a prerequisite, I think, because also it makes me think of the circle of tantrikas in Shaktism, for instance. You need to have the bodies of people present in order to have something happen here. And really, if you look at the ancient perspective, at least in some schools of thought, the body is just the material component of the soul. I just said this to someone the other day, and it really they were like, whoa, I've never thought about that before. But according to an archaic perspective, the body is not a separate externalization or vehicle, although it is also a vehicle, but rather the material part of a soul that has the material expression of a soul. So the body is the soul itself. It is the material element of the soul, but it is not separate from the soul. When we understand that, then we can understand that embodied experience is soul experience. And when we are with other bodies who are in this experience of soul, then we experience a corporate soul, a group soul together with them. And the psychodynamics of the group soul is immensely catalytic.
Nicely put. Yeah, I just want to add to this. I mean, there's so much going around, so much food for thought right now. Just to dovetail on this idea of inflation, obviously the community aspect is being talked about here as being very important, whether it's a lodge, a coven, or whatever. And aside from that, a teacher being really the most important part, if possible, but in a lot of cases that's difficult when we're looking at the Western tradition. I think that one thing that gets missed, and I believe it is rightfully emphasized in at least in the Buddhist tradition that I participate in, is starting with ethics and virtue as a way to maybe down the road avoid that inflation. So if you start with all the mystical, magical, really cool, interesting stuff, I think that's where you're more likely to run into issues. And I believe if you start with a more solid foundation, this is where you can have maybe more success and kind of avoid some of those pitfalls. Like in Buddhism, you have the 6 paramitas. You have wisdom being the last of the paramitas, and that's something that's gained through the 5 before it. You don't just jump to the wisdom. You start with generosity, and then you've got patience, you've got diligence, you've got the precepts that you have to pay attention to and participate in and be active in, and then wisdom comes naturally. I think a lot of the times we tend to jump right to the end, or want to jump to the end, where that's where all the cool, exciting stuff is. But the real work is in maybe the less romantic and less sexy stuff of kind of getting yourself decluttered.
I think Freemasonry is really positive in that regard. It really is an outer door that keeps your feet on the ground before you get your head too much in the clouds with this stuff. And you both mentioned something about service and charity. I think that caritas or agape or eros, any one of these forms of service and participation, I think is a great way to get yourself out of your own way, so that you're not the one that's the bullseye. You've got someone else or many other persons, but something other than your own progress is your concern.
Yeah, P.D, you said something there that's really significant, and that's mentioning the agape and eros. And for us to be able to understand the Platonic eros, that great daimon, that is the daimon of daimons, the daimon magnus, the daemon magnus. We have, what is eros? Where do we find eros but in deep relatedness? How can we understand the bonds of cosmic sympathy that weave the cosmos together into a sympathetic harmony, into a symphony, if we cannot even relate to our fellow man, woman, and child? We need to be able to build those meaningful personal relationships with each other. And it doesn't have to be in a lodge. It doesn't have to be in a magical group. It can be in your family. It can be in your friend group. It can be at a musical show. There are musicians out there who are also in a Dionysian way accessing the reality of the numinous. And there are different ways. But if we can't, in a very real, tangible way, in an embodied way, live that eros, and there's no way we're going to be able to experience the mystery of the celestial hierarchy or engage in anabasis and katabasis.
I'd like to throw in a quick quote I love from Bell Hooks that just applies to everything we've been discussing. She said, "I am often struck by the dangerous narcissism fostered by spiritual rhetoric that pays so much attention to individual self-improvement and so little to the practice of love within the context of community."
Yeah, love's the key to everything. Yeah, I just wanted to, a quick bouncing off something that Ronnie said before about the women who would help get people back online. I'm thinking of Gnostic Sanctuary and Rosamond. She was under Stefan Holler. She's gone now, but she was amazing how she could pull people back if they got off track.
I'd like to say something about something that Ronnie said earlier too, and that's it's just a sort of a comment on that, and then say one other thing. You said that Manly Hall, people came to him from all over the place. People who are, struggling with demonic possessions or trying to figure out what kind of God they were or things like that. And you were the screener. And they'd come and tell you their stories. That had to be the best educational experience you could have ever had, because you saw how truly beautiful, but also how truly messed up the spiritual path can be. And seeing it face to face with people and actually feeling a connection with them as they told their stories, I can't imagine a better teaching that you could have had than being the screener.
It was amazing. Another one that he did was he had me do occasionally funerals that he wasn't feeling up to doing, but I noticed that he would tend to have me do funerals where I had to do a balancing act. For instance, one where half the family were deeply into esoteric interests and the other half were fundamentalist Christians. And so when addressing this grieving family, trying to say words that could mean something meaningful to both.
Well, I think what Diane focused on after your Bell Hooks poem or comment, love. If you found a way to evoke a sense of love, then it probably spoke to everybody. And I think, I don't know, it was in response to, I think something Janice was saying about the body, and a phrase that came to me as I was working on my last book was, in this, I called it the Dionysian tradition, in this kind of Orphic Dionysian embodied tradition. It's not that I have a body, but I am a body. And that the body is the way that the soul is here. It's not like I have a body and it's some, it's a distant vehicle. No, this is the soul right here. Our bodies are
for this
how
incarnation.
we ensoul the world. And
because
as far as that goes, yes.
I'd like to jump.
I don't know my other incarnations, so I can't speak to it. Go ahead, Ronnie. Yeah.
I'd like to bring the secret of the golden flower in here because I think it sheds light on that. And so this is a Chinese alchemical text, Taoist, most likely, probably originated from channeling, according to recent research. Most famously championed by Jung and by Wilhelm, but there were actually a lot of mistakes in the Wilhelm translation, later corrected by Thomas Cleary. And what the story there, I'm going to oversimplify it terribly since we're in this limited amount of time, but the way that this teaching looks at the soul is that in the natural state, the soul is anything and anywhere and everything and everywhere. And when incarnation is taken on, the part of the soul, quote unquote, that draws together all this sand, all this matter, and gives it incredible organization. Everybody's working together in our bodies, right? All the cells, the molecules, the organs, there's all this harmony. It's like this incredible symphony or something to sustain us through time. And it's the harmony of the soul that creates this. But the soul can become so identified with this claustrophobic process that it forgets that it isn't just the body. And here's the birth of materialism. And there's this wonderful description in the Golden Flower of what it's like when somebody lives this way. And it says that they're leaking consciousness all the time. Their interests are all on the outside. And they're usually afraid of the world, that it's going to hurt them because they're very frail and impermanent. And they're angry and hateful and judgmental of everything and everyone. And very interestingly, fascinated with death and with killing and with murders and all the kinds of entertainment that have become so popular because to the what they call lower soul, this is relief, liberation. When you're contemplating death, you know there's an end to this claustrophobia. But when you do the practice and the awareness of the higher soul awakens or the divine vision returns, we see the world in a completely different way. We fall in love with it, and we feel that the world is impermanent and all that we cherish in it is limited in terms of its time here. And so we feel love toward everything, toward our bodies, toward the world. And there's this wonderful description in the Golden Flower where it says that when you achieve it, your heart and your bones are as calm as in deep sleep. And your vitality and your energy is like two lovers enjoying mutual bliss. And the relationship between the high and the low is like mother and child cherishing love for each other. This great harmony.
I definitely need to get that because that's among the most interesting reflections I can imagine hearing about, because it's that sense of alienation that you first described when we get so immersed and shut down, and then that creates a sort of a paranoia and a need to protect, and then paradoxically a desire to end it all, to escape from that sort of torture. That's a good description of
it is. And it's a luminosity of the spirit is said to leak out. And so they say that the soul is described at that point as a withered tree or dead ashes. And by reawakening, the body is revivified as well. So there's greater health. There's all the usual promises, longevity and clarity and good fortune and avoiding unnecessary troubles. And all those things are said to be the result of attaining the golden flower. And Manly Hall had a really great way. He wrote about it in the 50s and in this little article. And he said that every soul has a little trap door through which it can visit infinity and anything in the universe. And that's really the secret of the golden flower.
Yep.
So while we're on the point of embodiment, and I think that, I'm listening to your description of the golden flower, and it isn't surprising to me that it uses such language being part of a tantric tradition. One of the things that is, in my opinion, so significant about Tantra, and I do consider, again, I am a bit of a perennialist and a traditionalist, so I do consider Tantra and Gnosticism to be the same thing, essentially, in their essence. Flowering may be different in different cultures, but I'm getting onto a tangent here, but if you really look into history, you learn about the Silk Road, you learn about the Silk Road, you learn about the routes that ships took from Greece all the way over to southern India and things like that. And you start to see that this isn't just the fantasies of someone with certain religious proclivities who wants to see a unity of religions, but there is a historical precedent to the transmission of ideas, and not just ideas, but cults and practices. And one of the primary signifiers of Tantra, especially Shaktic forms of Tantra, is the emphasis on the divine feminine, on the mother of the universe, on the divine woman. And Greg put it even much better than I did when he said, the body is the soul. And that's an essential understanding in Shaktism. The body is not only the body is the soul, and then to speak in a Neoplatonic sense, the soul itself is a microcosmic form of the world soul, which in turn is feminine. And so everything we are is in essence the goddess. Our flesh, our bones, our thoughts, our soul, and interestingly, language. This is something shared in both Eastern and Western traditions. In the Gnostic book, the Trimorphic Protonoia, the goddess who we can reliably establish as Sophia or Barbelo, describes how she is in fact language, and how she descends beneath the language of the world rulers, and in fact is the eminence from which all language arises. And we see this even in Kali, in the descriptions of Kali, and how the letters of the Sanskrit alphabet are in fact emanations of the cosmic mother. And so I think when we understand this, that everything is this cosmic substance, this mula prakriti, this prima materia. When we understand that, and we cease to sever ourselves in a Kabbalistic sense through an overemphasis on the ruach, the egoistic personality, the temporary, the ahamkara of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, when we disinvest ourselves from the idea that we are something separate from the world, and understand that we in ourselves are literally one with the world. This is such a transformative perspective for those of us who have been raised in this atheistic, materialistic, post-enlightenment worldview. And this is something that this worldview is something that is embedded in our awareness from an early age. When we're children, we're being taught this worldview. I think, therefore I am. I'm separate from the world. Animals don't have souls. Nature is there for us to use. Women are subservient to men. These are all part of one paradigm, which is insidious and parasitic and not helpful. And I believe that the antidote right now, and this is why I love Greg's concept of Platonic Tantra, but I believe that the antidote right now is to reintegrate the cosmic mother.
If you know anything about Manly Hall, if you've heard of Marie Bauer Hall, you've probably heard that she was crazy and a terrible wife, which neither thing was true. But her whole life was devoted to the return of the divine feminine. She created a whole feminist cosmology that was based around what she called the space mother, and this Gnostic kind of idea that the creator deity of the monotheistic religions is her son, and that she, in this great selfless love of a mother, allowed him to forget her and to kind of ride the creation the way he wanted to. But she believed that ultimately what would save society was going to be the love of mothers, that the love that mothers feel, the selfless love, would eventually kindle a reaction in society and politics that would completely really create the Rosicrucian universal reformation, because that's what she was after. But it's interesting to me that she was seeing this necessity of the divine feminine, lecturing about it like in the 40s and 50s at lectures that Manly Hall was producing for her. And it's interesting that she became so demonized. She was a difficult personality, and her writing is very difficult. But even at PRS, his own place, she was dismissed and reviled. And I think that that's been the story for a long time, as we've been struggling through a patriarchal part of human history that at a time, I guess, had its uses, but seems to have outgrown them and is now on display in such a dramatic way.
I'm really interested in that. Janice, got on a roll there about the mother and feminine, and understandably so. And I think it came out of the reflections that you had on the Golden Flower, Ronnie. And what's most interesting to me is that place where we discover how constricted we are in our body, and how we're afraid of the world, and to be able to recognize the habit of being afraid of the world in myself. That seems to be an essential piece of what's needed to be dealt with or recognized or even embraced somehow, that I can have compassion for my paranoia towards the world.
Yeah.
That somehow I really am going to, as soon as we get off, I'm going to order Thomas Cleary's work on the Golden Flower, because if that's what he writes about, I think that I really have something to learn there. That's, to my mind, that's not, it seems like a very non-dual approach. I mean, if one can not resist one's own
fundamentally,
fear.
this is, go Ronnie.
Okay, thanks. It's interesting, just very briefly, Jung, because he was influenced by the original Wilhelm translation, which fell into that fallacy that we have to withdraw from life and live in isolation in order to achieve these spiritual understandings. But in fact, the real teaching, which Cleary corrects, was that you have to live a full life and you've got to be in the world in order to evolve.
That's why we're in
spiritually.
incarnation. We got work to do here.
And fundamentally,
exactly.
what Greg was just talking about, the fear of us versus them, inside versus outside, this very dual, like I'm afraid of the world, it's me against the world. Fundamentally, the idea of sunyata, or emptiness, is kind of a medicine for that kind of thinking, because it emphasizes kind of the interconnectedness between all beings, all things in the universe. There's no difference between you and I. I mean, on one hand, there's the reality that all things are different and there's all these different phenomenon and we're all separate. But the ultimate truth being that we are all connected without any distinctions, because there are really no things that exist independently apart from anything else. So I think that could be a cure to some of this kind of thinking that Greg emphasized.
Yeah, I think fear, it also goes further, and I'll illustrate it out of my own life. So I grew up around a whole family of war survivors who were untreated and were just berserkly post-traumatic stress. I was a premature runt kid who got beaten up all the way through school, pretty much until I became a maniac in high school. And I was afraid, I was really good at hiding and libraries and that turned around age 16, 17 into a hateful criminal a nihilist, a missionary nihilist with a band, no less, surrounded by bikers who did violence for me because they thought I wanted them to. And what really changed my
That's a good
life
story.
was running into the secret teachings of all ages at the Bodhi Tree bookstore. And of all the wonderful things in that book, the dedication to the rational soul of the world. Like in my world, there was no rational soul. There was no nothing. It was just a world of suffering and idiocy. And if, I could tell, human beings were the worst thing on the planet.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, Manly Hall helped me to see, no, actually, there is rationale to our world. And you can be a co-creator, a collaborator in the world and in creation. In fact, it's like a dance, the way that synchronicities will begin to happen and all the wonderful things, Diane, as you were pointing out when you reached out to Isis. And there's so much magic in the world when you allow there to be.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that so much of what's happening in the world today with hatred and war and division and demonization of opposites and all of that, especially the anger that drives all of that, is ultimately based in fear. And then in the defense mechanism that happened to me of, wow, if I lie and I'm a good liar, I have power. If I tell people these things about what I think reality is and they agree because they're angry too, then they'll do things for me. People figure that out and horrible things happen in society as a result. And I do agree that it's all of these things that we're talking about here today, the divine feminine, the Theurgy, the various forms of Tantra, Shingon Buddhism, all of these are the cure, are the medicine for this, because it changes everything into an experience of love. And I feel like if I could do that, like where I came from and what I believed and what I did, that anyone can.
I hope I'm not talking over you, but you're a very energetic person. And my feeling is that if you shut down or denied your rebellious, badass, hard-boiled, destructive, I'm in a band that beats people up kind of energy. If you shut yourself off from that, then you wouldn't have what you've got now. Somehow you were able to accept that, but in a different way. And that's the trick, is to somehow not deny how you are an excellent liar, or a very tricky son of a bitch, or all these other things, but somehow translate it into, transform it. Yeah, transform it is a nicer way to put it, right? Into what you are now. But you didn't deny it. It wasn't bad in the sense of, I got to get rid of it. But whatever it was in Manly Hall's introduction had a magical effect on you.
Yeah, very much. His presence was amazing. And love also. I fell in love just before that, and that changed my life as well. Yeah. But I think there's always symbols and signs. So for example, when I was in that band, I was given a gift by a girlfriend of mine of a statue of Anubis. And all I knew was that it was an Egyptian god of the dead. And death is what I wish for humanity, so I put it on the drum platform. It was as one of our symbols. But Anubis was there. And then later in my life, when I realized that Anubis was a guide, a psychopomp through the underworld, the gratitude that I felt that Anubis was there while this crazy stuff was going on. And I'm very fortunate that no one got seriously injured, including myself. And I feel like that's because that presence was somehow there. And I do think when you let it go creatively, because at least I wasn't out there organizing some sort of a, fascist militia or something. It was music, and I was trying to bring people together in music. I think when you do that, the gods respond and take mercy on us.
Take mercy on you. Right.
I think it kind of reflects where you really were. Yeah. You kind of are in the underworld, and Anubis shows up as kind of that beacon, a signal of a light at the end of the tunnel. change is coming.
In an Orphic Dionysian sense, we have both Olympian and Titanic elements in our composition, and so nothing worse than denying the Titanic, because that just creates an eruption of it in your life. You have to integrate the Titanic and the Dionysian into a synthesis, which is what I think Jung was saying when he was saying it's more important for us to seek as human beings wholeness rather than goodness. And I think that the necessary unspoken consequence of seeking wholeness and becoming as whole as possible, which has to be a dynamic, hermetic activity, I think, rather than a static state, is that goodness becomes attendant upon on the wholeness. The goodness comes to one who has become whole. And so we can't deny the darker elements in ourselves, but rather, there's a really interesting rendering of Greek myth and the hypostasis of the archons and on the origin of the world in the Nag Hammadi text, where you have an archon who repents and becomes the second demiurge, the benevolent demiurge. Most people, especially in our age of internet conspiracy theorism, where people don't really look very deeply at things, they don't realize that there are several demiurges. I mean, in Neoplatonism, there are several simultaneous demiurges, and in Gnosticism, sequentially, there's more than one demiurge. And the second demiurge is a benevolent cosmocrator who seeks to improve the world he was given, but he is essentially an archdemon who then becomes the god regent of our cosmos. So there you have a being that is in essence Titanic, becoming deeply benevolent, and I think that that's useful for us too, because we have the capability, we have the possibility of redemption within us, and I think that the immanence of compassion is a necessity. We have to be able to see other people as capable of transformation through that compassion, through love, through active engagement. And I want to pivot the conversation a little bit.
Before you do, could I just say one little thing? What you just said reminds me so much of the Vajrakalaya practice, right? That even demons have the Buddha nature. And so you summon them with noise and then you enlighten them.
Yes, and I think that's so essential, because the attitude that, say, demons, for instance, are unworthy, whether it's a demon in the flesh as a human, because we become demons when we become destructive and harmful to other living beings, or whether it's an immaterial demon, that attitude that it is just an evil being or just an evil person or something is a manifestation of that same orientation towards the world that causes us to see ourselves as separate from it. When you see that person as a manifestation of your own frustration or ignorance, when you understand that that person and you are one, then there is no way other than to have compassion for them. When we understand that we are flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone, blood of my blood. And I wanted to pivot the conversation a little bit in the direction of actual practical, because we have, I am the least of the people, least of everyone here, and we have some very wise people here in this conversation, in my opinion, and we've done a really great job elucidating different philosophical, theoretical, and theological perspectives. But let's get a little bit into practicality so that someone listening to this could walk away from it and go, I want to go try that, or I want to implement this in my world in a practical way. One of the things in a conversation we had with my friend Nicholas Schreck on the podcast that always stuck with me was we were talking about how in Tantrism, in Tantrism, it's not just the high ritualistic stuff that happens in these organized circles that is Tantra, but also the folk Tantra of the village. A young woman simply pouring a libation to the goddess is in essence the highest teaching, the highest manifestation, and understanding that even in the most simple actions, we may be actually performing a work of ceremonial magic, of union with the cosmos. It's really hard, I think, for Western minds to conceive of that simplicity. It's very easy for us to get deep in the weeds with the involved, complicated ideas and rituals and works, and those things work and they're valuable. But I think what's even more valuable is when we can break through to that radical simplicity, so that we understand that a simple libation can be so effective, or putting flowers at the base of a tree. It's all. It's there are different gradations of practice, but I think my question here is, how can we live this? What can a person do who wants to practice quote unquote Platonic Tantra?
Well, I have a few suggestions. I know in my Buddhist practice, we would just chant. You just chant, and that would put you in the frame of mind. I do tea ceremony for years, and you paying attention to every little detail of everything you move, you forget about everything else because you're so focused on how am I holding the dipper and I'm doing this and that. And it puts you in that frame of mind. But the thing that pops into my head now is making the mundane magical. Even vacuuming, you can consecrate a sacred space. You just have to have your antennas up where you're listening. So follow your heart with whatever attracts you. I was a kid, I was attracted to ancient Egypt and Greek. Whatever pulls you in, go with it. And anything you have to do it in a magical frame of mind. And you just have to think, I'm not doing a chore. I'm, consecrating a space, whatever, simple stuff.
I think what you just said is important, the activity itself, because, if all it took was to study these ideas, then all of academia would be enlightened, essentially. And we know that's probably not true. I would just kind of build on what you were just saying there. In Shingon, as you're aware, Diane, is the Sanmitsu practice, or three mysteries, where you have the body, the speech, and the mind. And since this is a discussion about tantric practice and embodied Platonism, I think that's a good place to start, is to replicate the activities that you want to embody. So you speak, in the case of Buddhism, you speak what the Buddha speaks. That's the mantra.
True.
Yeah, that's the mantra, the true word. And then you've got the mudra, or the hand positions you can do, or the different tantric things that you can do with your body. That can also be expressed in things like donating your time or things like that. And then you've got the mind aspect, so the body, speech, and the mind, where you're meditating on or envisioning what you want to change, or how you want things to go, or visualizing these different ritualistic things.
The subconscious doesn't understand negatives, so you have to have a positive what you want rather than a not X, because you'll get X.
Right, and stuff like mantra. Yeah, mantra, as you mentioned, and as we discussed, Greg, in our episode together, is not an intellectual practice. It's something that you do that turns a key, right, opens a different door, and it's necessary because you can't just become enlightened through intellectual study. And it's one of those kind of non-intellectual, non-dual practices that can get you there. So
I wonder if I'd like to hear PD's take, and I have a small story that I'll ask you to stay for if you would, Greg, because I think you'll like it. But I love what we're talking about here. So PD, how about something about what could somebody practically do?
It might sound funny, but my primary practice centers around foraging. I get out and I learn what plants are where, and I identify the signatures and interact with them as symptomata and symbola as best as I can, and try and discern and ascertain what gods I'm with at what moment, and turn what myth that means I'm participating in. And I do the same with stones. Every region has its own plants and stones and and animals, and these things change over the seasons. You know, I might go out, like right now, there are chanterelles everywhere out, cinnamons that we were foraging this morning. But when I go back in about a month, there won't be any. And I think about that kind of approach as the green tongue, you know, the language of the birds. Like there are certain times of the year when I can see certain types of birds migrating, and I know that means these plants are available now. And I just think that kind of immersion in your own environment where you are, and especially the theophagia aspect of it, the eating the god through foraging these foods and consuming them and being aware of what you're doing when you're doing it. That's really at the center of my whole approach.
Love that. That's awesome.
Love it.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, it really is. It really is.
So, first, I want to mention about cleaning that drudgery is really prevention of harm. There's nothing we do that's more important to prevention of harm than cleaning. And if we approach it that way, instead of the way our society has taught us to dread it, it becomes a loving gift to whoever we live with and to ourselves. But I want to say, in terms of something practical, one of the times that I screened someone for Manly Hall, it's a lovely human being, very humble bhakti kind of worshiper. And so I said, sure, you know, I thought he would like to meet him. And they did like to meet each other. But this fellow wanted Manly Hall to be his guru. And every time he saw him, he would, will you please be my teacher? And every time Manly Hall would politely say, no, young man, I don't do that. I'm no one's guru. Well, eventually it became annoying. And even Manly Hall has limits. And so he was sitting in the library one day and up walked this fellow and said, once again, I beg you, please be my guru, thinking that if he just showed enough devotion, Manly Hall would relent. It was all a test. Manly Hall raised his voice, the only time I ever heard him do that. And he said, young man, the entire world is your teacher. Nature is your teacher. Your life is your teacher. Pay attention to everything you do and learn from it. Now, he didn't say this, but the message underneath it was, hopefully you will learn that all your polite respect pissed me off. And that's the nature of the world, right? Like we can't always do the same thing and expect the same results. So being in the moment and all the wonderful advice that everybody's given here, these are great places to go. And keep in mind in your intent that you're taking the dare and you're going to see if the world is going to dance with you. And all of us here, I think, will tell you it will.
Well, and I think that's so awesome what you just said. I love that story. It's hilarious too. And and nobody had bad intentions there. I mean, the young man obviously had very pure intentions, but Manly in a way was acting as a guru by saying that to him, which is
exactly
the irony of it. I want to jump back on what P.D said for a minute about theophagy. I think this is a really useful way to understand how to practically live, how to do something on a daily basis, because we all eat. You know, I mean, I practice intermittent fasting, but I still eat. And what are we doing when we're eating? Well, when you understand from an animistic perspective that everything's alive, then literally everything you're eating is sacrificing itself to you. So in Manichaeism, there's this idea of the Jesus Patabilis, which is literally the light that's hidden within everything alive. It's hidden in nature. So it's in the Gospel of Thomas. He says, split a piece of wood and I am there, lift up a stone and I am there. So when we're eating plants, we're literally consuming consciousness, a living being. When we're eating animals, we're consuming a being that sacrificed its body for us. When we're consuming anything, we're consuming something that was alive and conscious. And I think that in the recognition of that consciousness, there can be a profound communion. And then when you offer that to a deity, which in the Indian tradition, it's called prasadam, you offer it to the god. then it comes back to you. And in the Egyptian tradition, it's the reversion of offerings. You make the sacrifice to the deity, and then you consume those things. It's in voodoo, it's in Christianity, it's in all of these traditions, is the idea of the sacred meal, which is offered to the deity first, and then we consume it. And it's so simple. It's so simple. We recognize the divine life within the food we eat, and then we offer it to the divine really as an act of gratitude, because it's the divine that offered it to us in the first place and provided that to us. And then hopefully, if we're privileged enough to, we share it with those we love. So we're breaking bread with those we love. That is so sacred, because if you're sharing a meal with those you love, which has been offered to the sacred, to the divine first, then when everybody consumes that meal, the divine unites all of them. And it's just incredible to me. In the Demotic Book of Thoth, we see this sacramental Eucharistic theology already present. It's present in the mysteries of Osiris. It's present in the mysteries of Dionysus. It's there everywhere, and it's literally eating. It's something so simple as eating. Just involve the divine in eating, and then share your meal with those who need it. And that also goes to performing alms to those who are homeless or helpless, in the form of giving them food or money for food or something. Even there, it's going back to food, to nourishment, to consuming the theurgy. So that's my contribution to the practicality discussion.
Lovely.
Very nice.
Thank you.
So I want to be,
Thank you.
respectful of everyone's time. I know we've gone for a little while. So having said all that, is there anything anyone would like to let our listeners know about, as far as things that you are producing, things that you're up to? I know, Greg, you've got a class that you're teaching today, right?
Well, yeah, it's just a presentation today about my book, but then I'm teaching a class that begins on July 17th through morbid anatomy.
Nice.
And that's just something I'm doing, right? It's easy to sign up for.
I just point people at lvx.org, which is Fraternity of Hidden Light, for one way to get in touch with me or other things going on.
Okay. And PD, you said you have a new book in the works?
Yeah. It's called Tripping the Trail of Ghosts, Psychedelics, and the Afterlife Journey in Native American Mound Cultures.
Wow.
It'll be out with Inner Traditions. I think they said the spring-summer session of 2025. So we've still got
Advanced
a
copy,
little under a
please.
year. Yeah.
You beat me to it.
That sounds
Yeah,
great.
sounds fascinating.
Um,
And Ronnie, you've always got stuff going on.
Yeah, I will be teaching a class for the Theosophical Society next year on metaphysical romances, the flamels, and all sorts of interesting star-crossed and otherwise love affairs in the metaphysical world. And if anybody has any questions, you can usually reach me through @the Ronnie Pontiac on Instagram. And I'm currently reading on our YouTube channel, which is also Ronnie Pontiac, a book that Tamara and I wrote about the unobstructed universe teachings, which coincidentally, everything we've been talking about is reflected there, coming from a completely different source that at the time, in the 1930s and 40s, they were very famous worldwide, but now are pretty much completely forgotten. So even though it's spiritualism and most people look down on that, this is a very high level of experiment, and convinced Jung that it was proof of the survival of consciousness after death.
Super cool. Thank you so much, everyone. This has been really great. I'm sure our audience is going to really enjoy this conversation and hopefully find some really enlightening information here. So thank you again.
Thank you.
And thank you, folks, for organizing this and inviting me to join you.
Oh, it's
Okay.
such a pleasure to speak to all of you. You guys are so inspiring.
It was wonderful.
Glad you found me.
Same.
Me too.
Take care.
All right, what a great episode that was. Wow.
We had a round table of some of the arguably most compelling minds in the fields of Theurgy, mysticism, and related fields right now. I mean, boy, I felt really humbled to be in the presence of all of these guys together, and so honored to just be involved in that conversation. You know what I mean, Dom?
Yeah, really was an honor to talk with them and also meet Diane, who we hadn't spoken to before. But it's always great to talk to Greg and PD, and of course Ronnie is awesome.
Yeah, and then to have them all together was so cool. It was just such an interesting thing to have a shared dialogue on these poignant, deep mysteries. Really
Right.
great thing. I feel like we're in such a renaissance right now with the understanding of theurgy among everything else. Theurgy it's so great to me that this is now a word that before, if you said theurgy to people, I mean, you and I were talking about theurgy 25 years ago, and this is a term that was really only used in specialized circles of people. Now the term has become more widespread, and with that widespread understanding of it, you have more people, I think, experimenting with it and experiencing it and learning how to experience it because of the greatness of minds like Greg and like PD and everyone else that we were talking about. I mean, the Orphic hymns. Again, you and I were talking about the Orphic hymns 25 years ago. And again, that was something that if you moved in certain esoteric circles, you might hear about, or certain academic circles. But outside of those circles, people didn't really even know what they were. Now the Orphic hymns are I would say, becoming increasingly more well known. And I think that's important too, because it helps people to understand that the idea of the sacred, of religiosity, is not something patented by the Abrahamic tradition. And I have reverence for the esoteric side of the Abrahamic tradition. It's just, I think that people in the West tend to understand the sacred in terms of that, and then some people become alienated by those unfortunate expressions of the Abrahamic tradition that condemn people and restrict them and all of that. And so that with that, often the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater. When people can see that a concept, elevated, refined understanding of religiosity and spirituality existed prior to organized Christianity, for instance, that had sublime conceptions of the divine, and even you could say similar approaches to interfacing with it, it kind of expands the perspective, and I would hope helps people to reclaim their relationship with the sacred.
Mm-hmm. You know, this was a long conversation. We were bouncing a lot of ideas back and forth, and I just feel like we, scratched the surface. We barely, exposed the tip of the iceberg in this conversation. There's so much more that could be said. But like you said, it's great because these conversations are happening now, and there are more scholars looking at this seriously, and more people thinking and writing about it and practicing it, most likely. So it's all good. And I really like the focus we had in the conversation to a degree, although we were bouncing all over the place of the kind of practical aspect, because that's what everybody always wants to know. How does this work? How did it work? What does it look like? What could it look like? And I hope that we are helping flesh out those ideas in this greater conversation about theurgy.
Well, and what you just said is the key, right? How does it work? How do you do it? How could it work? First, people need to know what it is, but then the next question is, okay, great. Now, how do we do it? You know what I mean? And now we have these answers. How do we do it? This is how you do it. This is doable today. This isn't just a 2,000 years old thing. This is a today thing. This is a relevant in 2024 thing.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to say, it's got to be taken seriously, like a serious endeavor with discipline. Because oftentimes you see a lot of very enthusiastic people, for instance, in like the neo-pagan community, and it oftentimes just ends up looking like cosplay or like you're at like a Renaissance festival or something. So I think there needs to be a more diligent level of discipline involved if you are going to take this kind of path seriously.
And that involves making peace with purification, fast, physical purification, mental purification. Catharsis is necessary in theurgy. We don't get to have it all the way we want it, and that's it. We have to adapt, especially to the higher. I think your point, too, about the cosplay is important because this isn't about performative showcasing. This is about doing it, doing the thing, and doing it right. Catharsis is necessary. Purification is essential to theurgy. If you want your theurgy to be successful, you have to be pure. You have to turn the senses of the soul inwards instead of outwards. And then what do you have? You have the interior senses, which are actuated, activated, and awakened. And then we can enter into communion with the series of procession originating in the henads, originating in the monad even, and concurrently come into harmony with our own interior monad. And with the development of that interiority comes progressive degrees of illumination. I mean, but what do I know? But all in all, this was a great episode. I hope that our listeners are happy with it. I know I'm happy with it. I know you're happy with it. I think that everyone who attended was happy with it. And I'm also really glad that we're able to boost the signal of these fantastic minds.
Because they deserve it. They're doing good work.
They do, and they're all such intriguing people. And with that said, I would love to talk about a book that is hot off the presses.
Let's do it.
All right. Are you going to cue that Reading Rainbow music?
It's playing right now as we speak.
Okay, so Tour de Force, A Formless Fire, Rediscovering the Magical Traditions of the West by Ike Baker. Ike Baker is a guy who we've had him on the podcast. He has his own podcast, very interesting fellow, intriguing fellow, educated, erudite, intelligent, also humble, kind, friendly, a good person. And he has really, I feel like he probably bled while writing this book because it is so meticulously written and so assiduously composed. I think that this book is amazing. It's really a survey of the Western mystery tradition, but it isn't vague and it isn't superficial. This is an in-depth, comprehensive exploration of the Western tradition in its origins, in its development, and in its current. It's subtitled Rediscovering the Magical Traditions of the West, and it is dedicated to the soul of the world. Now, this book, it goes into so much, but what I love is that it starts right away with Theurgy. The first chapter is Magic and the Mysteries, and it's on demiurgy, theurgy, and philosophy. And then from that, after he lays that foundation, showing that theurgy is really the foundation, he gets into astrotheology and astrological magic. He has a comprehensive exploration of divination and prophecy, alchemy, the Grimoire traditions, Kabbalistic magic. He goes into the spiritual awakening that happened in the Renaissance and the prominent magi who were responsible for that. He explores angelic magic, and he even gets into some of the invisible brotherhoods that set the conspiracy maniacs of the internet on fire, like Rosicrucianism and the dreaded Freemasonry. But he's just so deep with this book. I mean, he also gets into theosophy, and one of my favorite subjects, the French occult revival. I think, I don't know if I've made it clear, but I'm a big Oswald Wirth and Papou fan. And he just goes forward from there. He also gives a great exploration of the Golden Dawn and what's come from the Golden Dawn, and whether you like the Golden Dawn or it's not your cup of tea. If it wasn't for the Golden Dawn, we might not even be having these conversations today. And then he has several appendixes which basically give you practical guidance on doing your own work. Like he tells you how to consecrate a solar talisman, how to prepare an alchemical spagyric tincture. He tells you how to consecrate salt and water. He walks you through the middle pillar and the LBRP. This is just a cool book because it's not just theoretical, it's practical. And it's just jam-packed with information, but he writes in an accessible yet intellectually refined and developed way. So if you're a layman, you're entering in, you can pick this book up and it will guide you and give you an understanding that can take years to develop. If you're already in the tradition, you're going to love this book because you can pick it up and refer to it at any point, refresh your knowledge, deepen your understanding of some subjects which may not be your focus area. I can't recommend it enough. For anybody who's interested in the Western mystery tradition, A Formless Fire by Ike Baker, I give it 4 stars out of 4 stars. He did a great job here. I really think that this should be part of a curriculum for anyone who wants to learn about Western esotericism, ceremonial magic, theurgy, the alchemical tradition in the West and its origins. It's an excellent book. I was just going to say, and the art on the cover is also pretty neat. So,
yeah, Travis Lawrence, who is, I believe, a listener of the show.
Yeah, Travis is cool. His art is cool. I mean, you're really getting a powerhouse of greatness with this issuance, and we wholeheartedly endorse it here on the podcast. So thank you to everyone for listening. Thank you to everyone for supporting us. Thank you to everyone for supporting our wonderful guests on this show too. And, spectacular guests on this episode. We're grateful to each of them, and a big thank you to each of them for coming on. Wonderful roundtable conversation, and a big thank you to Ronnie Pontiac too, for organizing this, because he did a lot of the heavy lifting with organizing this conversation, and boy, that guy's a powerhouse.
Yeah, kind of like Ike, very busy at the moment, which is great because Ike is great and Ronnie is great. So the more content from them, the better we are.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, thanks to our listeners and thanks to our supporters. And with that, we bid you adieu until the next episode.